So here we are once again for the third roundtable in our Learning Change, Adaptive Social Learning for Transition Times. I'm coming from Gadigal country here in Sydney, the land that has been cared for many, many, many generations by the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge their custodianship of this land, which was never ceded to the British invaders, and to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and future.
So I wanted to follow on from our last two conversations and draw out some of those threads a little bit more today. And the starting question that I really wanted to frame things with was to ask who it is that's going to be imagining, defining, influencing, and enacting this transition, this Anthropocene transition that we've been talking about. So previously, Nora led us into the question of what is change, which is a really important framing for this. And Amanda then led us through the question of, I guess, the nature of power in change, and how that unfolds and where the dynamics are. So I wanted to dig into this question of who a little bit more with the Anthropocene transition. When I talk about who, I'm not just talking about humans. I'm talking about the more than human sense of things. So whilst we like to think that our fate is in our own hands somewhat as humans, but what if it's not? What if we start to experience greater and greater climate snapbacks? More of our other living systems, our other ecologies, our other ecosystems imposing their will upon us, our water systems, our air, our climate, all of those things we're, as you said, Ken, we've taken for granted for so long, and now we're starting to experience what it's like to live with huge forest fires, with smoke, with the same happening in California this year. Those systems are already starting to fight back in some way. But to follow that idea of, if it is us humans that are enacting this Anthropocene transition in some way, I'm interested in who has a say. So in my background in sort of participatory design, we're often thinking about marginalized voices. How do we bring them into the conversation? How do we look for the people who might have the lived experience, the indigenous people who've held the wisdom of how to live more in balance with our living world for much, much longer? How do those people get brought to the table? But whose agendas are actually driving this whole discussion in the first place? So, and is it in partnership or is it in conflict? There are very different conditions with which we can meet. And is it with the full diversity of the natural world? Are we thinking of our echidnas and our rosellas and the mycelial networks under the soil? We can't just talk about the earth, kind of like young people get, the voice of youth gets to have one young person on the panel occasionally. We can't have the voice of nature where somehow we make the whole of nature beholden to one voice. But I guess the primary question for me of this is, okay, so who are we giving a seat at the table to? But whose office is it in? So who owns that table and what's the agenda that's driving that discussion in the first place? So to add to that vein of who, I'm also kind of interested in the how. So how do cultural and systems change? How does that happen? What are these cultures of transition that we're talking about? What what precedents are we using? What mental models are we invoking? And for me, I guess that culture of transition from my own perspective kind of looks maybe a little bit more like a futures plural orientated culture, thinking about what that future is that we want to move towards. It's got to be deeply relational. Often we talk about moving at the speed of trust. And it's got to be adaptive. I guess this is where the collective learning comes in for me. But it also pulls together some of the thinking about adaptive strategy and who we actually bring to the table and how we have those discussions in the first place. A lot of my work in Lifehack over in New Zealand, where we're working on youth mental health, was deeply relational in the way we approached trying to change the system of youth mental health. We moved from quite an entrepreneurial standpoint in the early days to actually changing to fundamentally be about rewiring the relationships in the system and virtually nothing else. So those cultures of transition are interesting, and we need to understand what kind of transitions we're looking for. But I guess the only other thing that I really want to add to this is, given what we know about the urgency of the Anthropocene transition, whether we're looking at human survival or whether we're looking at more than human survival, so rather than a further huge extinction events of other species, I believe that the sort of fundamental needs of what we need to be practicing together at the moment is this ability to learn and adapt at speed, but a speed that doesn't break relationships, which is all too often the case. So with this, I guess there's a couple of different ways that we can think about this Anthropocene transition to some extent. One of which is this idea that seems to be so heralded, especially in Western culture, of the master plan, the strategic plan that's going to lay it all out and tell us what we're supposed to be doing. Or I guess there's the other area that I've been fascinated in due to kind of walking into complexity science and learning about this idea of islands of coherence where things are working together, but this idea that there actually needs to be tens of thousands of simultaneous experiments happening, where those experiments are loosely joined, where people are talking to one another and sharing their perspectives. So I guess that's my framing for tonight. I want to talk about the who and I want to talk about the how. So yeah, I'm fascinated to hear what my fellow people have to say. Thanks very much.
Well, can I just make the comment while you're thinking about what you're going to say? Sam, I love the term moving at the speed of trust. And what came over to me in your framing remarks was a kind of radical tension between the centrifugal forces that the change in the Earth system, which we call the Anthropocene, is creating. And they're not just centrifugal forces in the non-human world, but they're centrifugal forces within human societies, politics, technology, just about in every area of human culture, versus the fundamental necessity of holding the center, the center of our being, our societies, moving together.
So I really like the who stuff about who has a say, and then, whose chair are they sitting in, and then whose room is the chair. That makes me think of Stephen Luke's 3 Dimensions of Power. I don't know if people have, it's like this tiny little book. It's such a good book. It was written in the 1970s. And I guess maybe I'm saying this partly because we did Power last week and I said, ignore Stephen Luke's. And on this point, I think it's really interesting because this speaks to this question of who. And he said there are 3 dimensions of power. The first dimension is who has a say, right? That's who has power, right? Who has a say is who has power. And they said, yeah. But that's only a bit of it, isn't it? whose agenda upon which is the say being had, right? Second dimension of power is agenda setting, right? If Murdoch is running a campaign about arsonists causing bushfires, then it's not just like it's a fair conversation. Having a seat in the room is not all seats are equal, right? The agenda is informing the conversation that is going on. Everyone's reacting to that agenda. Even if you're saying you're against it, you're still reacting to that agenda. That's a form of power. And then the third form of power, he calls it ideology. I don't find that language helpful. I think it's of its time. I think it's better to think about it as narrative, as storytelling. It's like, whose meta story are we talking about? Who sets the story upon which the agenda, upon which the seat is canvassed? These three dimensions of power. And I wonder how that fits into those, maybe when we're thinking about who talks, it's like who the people, plus with what agenda, plus with what story. Maybe there's a couple of things there. Anyway, maybe we can play with it, or maybe we reject Luke's like we did last week. The second thing I wanted to add is that point that you raised around how do people work together? Are they in partnership or are they in conflict? I think that's like I've written a book about coalitions. Like, this is a topic that I could talk forever about. And it's something that I think a lot about. And sometimes you want broad and sometimes you want narrow. Like, the art of coalition building is like, my general thing is our intuition on it is mostly wrong. Like, it takes a lot of thinking to build a good coalition. And my initial intuition on it was definitely wrong, which was, I thought, we should have everyone in the tent, this massive coalition. And they tend to not work because no one can agree on anything except to put their names on a letter. You know what I mean? Like, it's so simplistic and trite. So building powerful coalitions, powerful partnerships is really important. And where are the battle lines being struck? Like, where are the conflicts? Because there will be conflict. And what is good conflict? And what is toxic conflict, and with whom are we in conflict? I think is actually the question. Like, we can't not have conflict because actually certain interests are going to be denied in a transition and certain interests are going to be advanced. There will be conflict, but understanding where the dimensions of it, I think, is really interesting. And I think we can learn from coalition for thinking about coalition building in coming at that question, because I think we're talking about forming coalitions of interests and constituencies. So maybe that's a thing we can come back to. And then the final one is about the how. So, thinking about the culture that we need. The research that I've just recently done on people power is sort of aligned to the idea of the islands of coherence, that different people will do different things. I have come to I'm writing a book that basically makes a similar argument about change, which is that there are different ways to what I call to enact people power, engage people in joint action for an outcome. And they're different, right? We can play by the rules and seek to petition our politicians and be quite conventional, or we can mobilize big demonstrations, or we can do organizing, which is build massive levels of leadership, or we can prefigure the change we want by modeling things, or we can engage in political parties, for instance. They're all perfectly valid forms of people power. And all of them have strengths and all of them have weaknesses, right? So mobilizing is great at what you talked about in terms of speed, but that's also its greatest weakness because it tends to fizzle. Organizing is beautiful in terms of how it negotiates leadership and relational culture, but it's crappy when it comes to time. It takes a long time. And so I wonder if there are ways in which we can think about this how question that don't seek to identify a singular form of change, but sort of multiple routes to that goal, and think about how those different routes need to relate to each other productively to get there. So they're my social change interpretations of your outline.
I think that's a really, really great point, Amanda, that it's going to take lots of different shapes and sizes and textures and flavors and approaches, and that's actually what it means to respond to any kind of complexity. It requires complexity. So this idea that you could have any kind of a singular, or even, just a few different paths in toward what it is to be responding to the changes. And it is a misnomer, because the way in which things get brought into togetherness is, of course, through multiple contexts, multiple languages, the language of words, the language of music, the language of passion, and the language of politics, and the language of the arts, and the languages of community building, of architecture, of agriculture. These are all different ways in which we are engaging with each other and the world. So, of course, all those have to shift if we're talking about something like systems change. But one thing I really liked about what you said, Sam, that, and maybe it was just the way I heard it, but is this kind of stepping back from the idea of you're the ones making the change to, well, what if you're not? What if, look at what happened with and is happening with the virus. So, for how long were people talking about the need to cut down on air travel? And it was like, yeah, but we can't, and no, but, what are we going to replace it with? And and then suddenly there was a little virus that came from the side, and part of the response to the virus was actually a drop in air travel. So this idea that what we may actually be tending more than we think is not so much the capacity to make change, but the capacity to respond. And that to me seems much more like training to be in an improvisational band or a theater group, or that it's about not necessarily knowing what's going to happen, but having some kind of perception change underneath it, so that no matter what happens, there is a way to respond that is coming from a different set of logics and deep sort of presuppositions than the ones we've got baked in now. And when I say we, I'm using that term lazily. But I roughly mean the habituated Western cultural response to, all sorts of things. We need a strategy. What are the outcomes? We have to have, particular ideas of what makes something serious or not serious, and what it is to be successful in our world. There's all sorts of things that are informing those presuppositions. So, but I think that I would like to introduce a word here. It's a great word, and it's the word stochastic. And stochastic is a word that comes from math. Probably most of you are familiar with it, but just for the sake of it, I'll give it a little description. And stochastic essentially means, or the way I'm using it, it means kind of mostly random, not entirely random, because what does that actually even mean in a world that's built of relationships that are relationshipping, but mostly random. So it's the difference between setting out to make change or setting out to shift the conditions in which the change then makes change, which changes change that makes change. And I'm not trying to be cute here, actually. I really am very serious that the biggest shifting is around how the relationships can make relationships. It's not the thing you do now, it's the way the thing you do now sets the tone and the possibility for the things that come from it. which you may not know. So it's not random, but it's a little bit random. So that there's a way of allowing for and this is, I think, for me, why tone is so important. Because it's kind of setting the limits, not for what is said, but what can be said, not for what is done, but what could be done. And that, I think, is really where a lot of, to your point, we are all living in a time in which things around us are changing rapidly. So no matter what your agenda is, probably you're going to be in a position of responding instead of leading, and that is not going to be necessarily clean and pristine. Climate change is not necessarily happening to communities that are, stable and healthy and happy and filled with, perfect mental health. We're already in a situation where the changes that are taking place in multiple ways. So of course the response has to be parallel in that multiplicity. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that. Stochastic. So something about stochastic change. When you're making art, you can start and think, I'm going to make this thing, and then you put yourself in it, and then you wait, and then you wait some more, and then you don't really know when it's going to happen, and then suddenly it starts to become, and the becoming becomes more becoming, and it starts to happen, and it's not really very recognizable from the place you started. But there's some way in which that stochastic process is necessary.
I guess, I don't know. So from when you're talking and when you're all talking, I get different ideas. So Nora, that your thoughts there just led me to this idea that we need to embrace uncertainty. And I guess you look at Heisenberg there, and the smaller the mass of something, the greater the uncertainty is about it, is basically the idea. Like one of the big ideas that I get out of that anyway. I know it's not the focus of it, but it's true. And where I see so much change, really complex change happening is in little things that people aren't noticing. And it's the aggregate of all those, So I see, and this reflects what's happening in the landscape. It reflects the way country is talking, the way the land is talking. And I want to get to that idea of land having voice, Amanda. Where power and powerlessness comes into having voice, and then how much power land has. But so, yeah, I'm seeing like so many of these like small, just individuals, organizations, throwing up all these amazing experiments, in real-time experiments. And I like the way Sam said we have to do that at speed. He didn't say, people usually say at scale there, which is the wrong way. But yeah, doing it at speed. So you're seeing, the 1,000 flowers are blooming, and things are emerging from that, and it's interesting. It's neither good nor bad. It's just interesting because it's following patterns I see in the landscape, where it's small things where I'm noticing the impacts of climate change. Small things like flowers, things like this, but even smaller. So as a woodcarver over the last decade, I've really noticed a really massive increase in sort of fungal and bacterial sort of infections in wood. Like, going to, seeing a tree that looks perfectly healthy, or a branch, and cutting into it and it's all just mush in there. And it's been these small things just eating it out. and it was never like that before. And I've been noticing that's been escalating. And so more and more of the wood that I try and use, you know, I get halfway through it and find that it's rotten at the core, or there's a fungus or a mold eating it out from the center. And I guess you get those things with different temperature changes, you know. Yeah, that Holocene is definitely on its way out. And I don't know if it's an Anthropocene moving in now, but it doesn't really matter what we call it. The land is speaking, and I guess you don't get to have a voice. You don't get to have a platform when you're powerless. And I guess a lot of people are seeing the land as powerless, as something that we need to somehow confer a platform to or give human rights to. So we're going to, you know, give legal status, you know, we're going to give human rights to this river in New Zealand, or we're going to, you know, give the land legal status so it will have a voice, you know, through our ridiculous tinkered paper little systems. And it really doesn't care about that. The land doesn't care. It's moving, and it is powerful. It's very powerful, and it's starting to move. And it does have a voice. We have at my university, I think it's happening in a few different places now, but at my university, a lot of people are starting to put as a co-author on their papers the name of the country, the land where they're doing their research. So the indigenous name of that bioregion, they'll put that as the first co-author of their paper, like as the lead author on the paper. The idea is that knowledge is coming out of the landscape. That's great in papers where that knowledge is coming out, but it's I don't know, it's no good in papers where it's just a tokenistic thing, I suppose. Yeah, and there is that idea of power and the association of between power and violence. And I guess last time we talked a bit about the need for violence as a force in the world to be distributed evenly throughout that system, the way it is in a natural system. Because when it's evenly distributed throughout the system, it does minimal damage, you know, so you don't have those massive concentrations of power and monopolies of violence that sit for too long, sort of stagnating with any group or any particular place. And I think that's really important. But it's sort of funny in this time of transition when things are so out of balance, you know, you see that power shifting and those, you know, different modes of violence and conflict sort of conferring power briefly to this lot and then that lot and then this person, then that person. They don't seem to be holding it for long. It moves very quickly, you know. And so people gain voice and platforms where they were voiceless and powerful before, by wielding different forms of violence temporarily before somebody takes it off them, and it's like a big football game or something. So maybe that is an action where we're seeing an escalation in violence around the place, and we're seeing the rise and falls happening, you know, with these monopolies of violence happening very quickly, and people increasingly finding different tools that they can use, like you know, harnessing the power of outrage, you know, to attack, or, you know, there's an incredible violence in willful ignorance, in asserting willful ignorance, and, you know, throwing that out there. You see a political system where, you know, the side that wins is the side that can smash stuff faster than people can put it back together. You know, as a way of discourse happening. You know, there's so much of that cycling round and round. But I think that's probably, like, when you look at when that occurs in natural systems, when there's an imbalance, you do see an escalation as it starts to head towards some kind of stability, you know, a kind of escalation. And you see, you know, sudden massive population spikes in one thing that's incredibly destructive. So you get a locust plague that rips across Western New South Wales and strips it bare, and then they all die and drop off. But then that gives rise to something else, and you see a lot of these disturbances happening. You get a massive fish die off, and then when you see that happen, Well, you know that story that goes all the way down the river, and that story finishes on Kangaroo Island, so that you know within 12 months Kangaroo Island will burn. And you see these sort of escalating, rolling meta crises. And the land is moving, and it's shaking itself like a dog, getting fleas off. And I think as the increasingly violent movements of the land keep escalating, I think we're going to probably hear that voice speaking a lot clearer, that voice of the land. And I won't go on for too much longer, but the voice of the land, I mean, it carries the law of the land, and it's really natural. A lot of it at the basic level is natural law, and it just makes sense. It's pretty simple, and a lot of it's about, there's just things that you shouldn't combine. There's things you shouldn't mix together in nature. And I had this debate recently over, whether or not computers have dreaming, or styrofoam has a dreaming, or something like that. And yes, it does, but it's coming from wrong story. It's a lawless combination of elements that really shouldn't be happening, and nature tells you these things. There are natural laws that when you produce this kind of, combination, this synthetic combination to produce this substance or this machine, then, you get poisons that will destroy your air and your water, and you'll die. There are natural consequences, causes and effects. Any species that has fathers mating with daughters, so that combinatorial, is nature will take care of that, because the law against that is not like a human law, that's natural law. So you will get birth defects, and if the culture continues doing that, or a population of animals even continues doing that, then that population will end pretty quickly. So there are natural laws. There is law in the land, and it's constantly speaking. Yeah, so that's all that is for the voice of the voice of the land, and the power of the voice, and the violence of power, and that little logic sequence.
I think you've taken us in many different places, and down many different many different.
No, you took me there. You put all the threads there. I was trying to bring them together. Not maybe I made it worse.
No, it's good. I mean, it definitely. I think I think it was towards the end of our first discussion with Nora's talk about how people are brought back into relationship with country. It really sort of highlights that that discussion that's just so vital to be had for those of us, those settler folk of us who like, I've traveled across the other side of the world as a first generation migrant. The struggle to know how to come into relationship with this place is really strong. And for me, I've come to that from working in the conservation sector. So for me, it was like learn what the country needs, learn how to care for it in whatever sort of potentially slightly broken Western scientific view that might be. And then obviously read like hell, or just try and put yourself in the into experiences which start to shape your understanding of what you're getting wrong. So obviously I've been reading Victor Stephenson's book Fire Country recently, and it's of course blowing my mind about the types of fire that used to be used in this country. And it's profoundly moving for me to hear of those vivid descriptions of, a light wispy smoke in the stringy bark forest that can be walked on with bare feet. Like that kind of description profoundly changes my relationship to fire, which so far has been dominated by bushfires, media, you know, all of that sort of side of things. So obviously, you know, the age-old kind of story of where does change happen? You know, does it happen within? Does it happen without? You know, obviously there's a big part of that there for me to grapple with. I wanted to pick up a little bit on Nora's point about stochastic and this idea of sort of mostly randomness, but I can't exactly remember the phrase you used, but something begetting something else almost. And thinking a lot about, so the other world that I've spent a bit of time in is sort of the biomimicry world, trying to understand a little bit more about, you know, how I have a lot of criticisms, but it's an attempt to understand how nature works, so that we're able to understand how we better design whatever it might be. So whether that's a material or a train or a living building, whatever it might be, you know, our wastewater systems, all of that can be better designed if we understand how nature does it, so we can design our place better. But it makes me think a lot about that practice of, so in biomimicry, we talk about like the genius of place, or the wisdom of place. And so going to a place and just immersing yourself so that you are observing and you're noticing and you're beginning to tune into the voice of country, you know, essentially it's what we're talking about there. It makes me think a lot about that sense of something begetting something else. There's so many patterns of this in nature, right? Whether we're talking about the beaver dam where you know, life begets life. So a beaver dam, it's not creating that habitat for something else on purpose necessarily, but of course it does create the conditions conducive to life for a whole range of other species. And this pattern is so prevalent. As soon as you start looking for it, you see that life being conducive to life pattern happening over and over again. So, I mean, I guess I'm stuck a little on this idea of cultures of transition, and how do we take some of this understanding about potentially the voice of country that we need to be listening to more, and how do we start to bring that into the how do we start to influence the bringing back into relationship with country? How do we experience it enough that we can embody it to become the culture of transition, rather than talk about it in an abstract way? Because I personally believe that's what needs to happen. So there's a further provocation for anyone who wants to take it up.
Yeah, there's that butterfly effect, you know. It has knock-ons. I'm not speaking out of turn here. I'm bringing a message from my beautiful spouse Megan. She said to tell you, or tell them to sort out their bloody dogs. And I know that sounds flippant, but it is that something begetting something begetting something. You know, it's an intractable problem in cities, people with dogs. It's absolutely insane. And she said, if you could sort that out, you could figure out a way to sort that out and get everybody behind that and on board with it, then you would have the mechanisms to sort out everything else, just from one thing. You know, how do you do that collective sense making with, you know, 7 million people or so in a city, and half of them own dogs, and they're just I don't know, the insanity of thinking that it's all right for that dog to defecate on the grass where your children are playing, and that's fine as long as they sort of pick it up with, you know, with a plastic bag, and that you don't know where that cuck has been, but I mean, it's still there. And my kids are rolling around on this grass that's like covered with the greasy caca of 1,000 dogs. I mean, it's this is a dog that's supposed to be in a pack. It's supposed to be hunting. It's supposed to be helping to shape the course of rivers. It's supposed to be roaming over, you know, hundreds of hectares of territory. And it's this poor little thing must be every genetic signal is just screaming in frustration. But we like dogs. I like to have a dog. I like to have my dog. He's my best friend. And there's such a sentimental attachment to that. There's so many sort of legal systems in place around it and blah, blah, blah. But how could you work on convincing that many millions of people that having a dog in a city is a really bad idea?
You should probably take a look at the conversation that happened in New Zealand about cats. That didn't go
right. Yeah, that would have to be next. Yeah, but once you can do that, then you'd sort it out. And I guess my response to that was, well, I mean, you wouldn't have to attack the dog problem head on. All you'd have to do is change the law to allow people to have native marsupials as pets. If that was allowed, then you guarantee the survival of a lot of endangered species. Also, you know, most of them don't live more than a few years. So, you know, you're not stuck with this pet forever. So people, you know, would enjoy that. If they escape and go feral, well, that's awesome. You know, it's just a win, 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 a situation like that. And so like everybody that'll be the latest trendy things, and everybody wants a numbat. And it's like, well, I got to get rid of this dog. So that was my solution to the dog problem. You know, but it always comes from, it's always a tangential solution. It's always from left field that the solution presents itself. But then also, as Nora is saying, when the solution happens, you know, it comes out of something that gives rise to something else, that gives rise to something else. And you can't predict that.
I mean, yeah, that I guess I'm just, yeah, that's exactly what I'm sort of saying here. And one thing that I wonder is how, like you said, Tyson, just the little things, just the way that we are thinking about our, you know, how to talk to our kids, or what is breakfast, just the little things, the dogs, you know, the layers of old system logic are buried deeply in all the little things that we do. And so even changing a little thing can actually unlock all sorts of really big changes. I mean, even just changing the way you are in conversation with your partner, or the way that you are in intimate relationships with people, changes the way they feel about their body, changes the way they are in relationship with their children and their partners and their, right? So but it has to do, I think, for me, one of the things I keep coming back to is that there's this deep underlying messaging in, I don't know where it came from, but anyway, it's everywhere, of what's in it for me? In what way am I going to get ahead in this relationship? Whatever it is, even when it's your kids, there's the sense that if my kids are successful, it'll say something good about me, and I can, you know, it'll make me successful. So it's bizarre, this thing of what's in it for me. And it's like a little, you know, ink bucket that just stuck on everything. And how to think about what sort of tone and gesture and formations of action come out of a shift from away from that notion of what's in it for me.
Very quick response to that. Well, Amanda formulates a response here. But yeah, there is a very strong connection between your relationship with land and your relationship with your intimate partner. Very strong relationship. So how you think of the land, how you approach land and treat the land is pretty much going to reflect the way you treat your partner. And it may just be, I love you, but I don't understand you yet. It could be that, which is really nice. Or it could be that I'm going to shape you into a shape that satisfies me. It could be, I'm here to extract energy from you. All of these different things. When you think of all the different permutations and pathologies around intimate partner relations, and every single one of these you'll see reflected in the landscape.
Wow. I was going to respond to what Nora said, but that's really, that's really interesting. That's very provocative and interesting. But I'm not going to come to that right now. I just wanted to really riff off the piece that both Tyson and Nora talked about in terms of the sort of the small things begetting change, because it resonates with me in this idea of prefiguration. So prefigurative change, it's a concept that, you know, was developed by anarchists in the 1800s, and also by in the sort of Christian tradition, prefiguring the life after death on earth. And it's the idea that you would model the change that you're seeking in the work that you're doing. So you might want a participatory democratic world like they did in the Paris Commune in 1972. So they created the kind of democracy that they wanted to embody in the work that they were doing, right? So it's they implemented that idea. Now, this kind of practice has gone way beyond sort of ideological anarchist tradition. It's quite a widespread thing, more prevalent, not particularly prevalent, you know, for the Australians here, not that prevalent in Australia. It was big in the 1970s, the creation of Elsie's Women's Refuge in the inner west of Glebe was done through an occupation, and it's still around, you know, 45 years later. It was prefiguring. So rather than going to the government and going, knock, can you please give us some money to set up a women's refuge? And the government was saying, no. They just did it themselves. Right? And then they operated with some really strong values, like in every sense, modeling the kind of thing that should happen in a women's refuge. The reason why I raise it is that it embodies this same idea of the practice begetting the change, because it's not simply that they created a women's refuge in Glebe, or I've worked with some people in Cape Town who've done something not dissimilar in creating inner city housing for Black, poor and working class communities that through occupations have created housing solutions. The thing that is equally done in that space is build a culture for change. Leaders rise up and see something new in themselves because they're capable of making change. Things change in the system around them because it's something that seemed impossible is now made possible. Like this is a sort of this radical process of reimagining that occurs when people embody the change in everything that they do. In some ways, because I think sadly, it's unusual. There are too many hypocrites who walk the world, who pretend that they're the change makers who don't practice what they preach, right? You know, you see them in politics, but you see them in the not-for-profit world all the time. And people just don't buy it, you know. But when people are so intentional about that it matters, that people are watching, you know, that actually you've got to do as you say. There's something so powerful in that. I think also the point that Nora, I think, well, both of you, I think, raised, that it also just changes you. If you start intentionally practicing your own values, you change. You know, when I started, you know, doing the Sydney Alliance and doing, you know, 15 to 20 relational meetings a week, which are these sort of quite intimate one-to-one conversations with leaders, all these meetings with these amazing people across Sydney, it changed me. Like I shared more of myself. I learned about people. I just understood the place that I was in so much better than I ever had before. You know, I sort of by tending to others, I tended to myself, all that sort of stuff. Like you change too in that sort of in prefiguring something. So in some ways, it's like the butterfly effect, right? You never know what happens as a consequence of, you know, a one-on-one conversation. How could that possibly change the world? People used to say that to me with the Sydney Alliance, right? Like we were doing this massive thing, but actually it was very slow and small, apparently very small, on the surface very small, but big things happen in small. There's something radically big that can happen even in something that looks small. I think too much in my world of social change, there's too many people who talk about scale, all this sort of bullshit about scale. It makes me laugh, but too much talk about cheating, shortcuts to power and shortcuts to outcomes, and now Biden's elected, isn't the world going to be better now? Like, it's ridiculous. It's like so much more significant a thing that we need to do. And I agree with Sam, like, we need to think about time. Like, we don't have endless time, but we do need to take the time to do it well, because that the radicalness of doing it well is so potent.
I did mention before Sam jumps in that idea of that a discourse landscape where the winners are the people who could smash things faster than everyone else could put them together. And in that kind of landscape, it is very difficult. Well, it's not difficult. It's just integrity doesn't have any currency anymore. A lifetime of walking your talk can be eradicated with one tweet or in 3 minutes. Just by anything. I could say, Amanda, I heard you had a 16-year-old boyfriend, and that's it. I probably just ruined you just now, just saying that. It's all your organizing, all your work, that's gone, finished, that's done. We're in a landscape where people can just fire things left, right, and center, and it's kind of a race to the bottom. Everybody's really kind of mired in it. So there's that. But I just wanted to get to this idea of, your way to move through that is to keep moving. So, the landscape is moving right now. It's all in motion, and you have to be moving with it. You not only have to be adaptive and resilient, but you're going to need to be able to, boom, go and do this project for a bit and then stop, go over there, see a completely different project, boom, go over there, keep moving like that. Because the pace is rapid, and Sam's bringing that variable of time in, and this sort of sense of urgency. I think it's important, not only in how quickly we need to achieve our outcomes, but also just in the rhythm and the pace of how we do our lives and have these conversations. So you might build some integrity and respect over in this place, but then you need to leave that there and go and build more in another place, and you need to do it quick, and then you need to leave that behind and let that become what it's going to become and go to the next one. And you have to seed all of those things and have all those flowers blooming. Because the land is moving, the land is speaking, and I guess the land will act directly itself through its big movements, but it's also going to act through its human custodial agents, through every single one of us that's connected to and listening to the land and acting on the land's behalf. It's going to be acting through us as its agents, and it'll either do that and do it effectively, and we'll sort it out, or it will do it itself, and it will move things pretty catastrophically. That's that thought. What do you think, Sam?
I'm sensing we might have an uprising of the quackers at some point that come to let us know that maybe we're not getting it right. I think the provocation, like the pre-configuration stuff's really interesting, Amanda, and certainly see patterns of that in sort of how I've approached things in the past and how I've felt like things have moved around me when I've made a decision. I guess I'm wondering whether there was something that we touched on last week around power and progressive movements, and sometimes how those progressive movements can sometimes get into their echo chamber of their own sense of like what needs to be done, and that then spirals into this ignorance or the ignoring of other voices. I think deep democracy teaches us always to look for the no, We're hearing pretty big no's from you know, the alt-right and the, you know, various what we would class as fringes, but that ignoring of people's frustrations, people's perspectives on the world, when those aren't actually addressed and brought into relationship, they tend to come back to storm the stage at some point. I guess I'm thinking a little bit about like what it takes to create those genuine spaces, and that sort of the relational or the social infrastructure to create those places where power with or power to, or whatever you want to call it, can exist without othering people, and how that can bring, like, how that can be done at the speed and the development. Obviously, Nora, you've been thinking a little bit about this, so I'd love, perhaps this sort of rolls into some of your thinking, but yeah, just thinking a lot about that's social relational infrastructure for for bringing ourselves into relationship with others and trying to explore the world a little bit more to bring about those transitions that aren't then slowed down by that no, or that, you know, that tension that's being held, because it feels like when you're fighting a lot of battles on a different front, you're not actually able to bring our war metaphor back in. We're not actually able to move at the speed and do the relational work that needs to be done.
I think that there's an interesting kind of, there's an underground, there's a hidden world. And so much of the actual, the kind of the ground shift is in the soil of our being. And yet there's a lot of talking kind of about personal growth or about making change, but there's the deeper work is actually, and this is what is happening with the warm data work, is that it isn't about going into a subject, say ecology or education, and getting exhaustive about it and finding out all the details and being super informed so that you know exactly what change to make. It's not about that. It's about looking at how education is in your own body as a memory of experience, and how that experience then has played into other contexts of life, from family to culture to identity to economy or your health, or and so it's very much working kind of below the radar of a lot of more easily accessible conscious verbal processes, and I try to do that with this process is not about manipulating. It's about creating a space where people can actually explore these conditions and reflections in their own way, through their own memories, and that instead of, okay, so basically with propaganda, you tell people what to think and you take away context. Okay, in the warm data space, you add a lot of context and you don't tell anybody what to think. and the shifting that takes place then takes place in very different ways. So what happens is you start to see even aspects of your own life in another way, because you're looking at them through different contextual experiences. And so it's through that what is starting to occur is that we are seeing groups of people who are able to perceive the interdependencies and the processes of those interdependencies, but they're not abstracted into interdependency world and language. It's you know, there's Korzybski said the map is not the territory, and the language of complexity is not the complexity. right? So the complexity is in your life, and in the way your life is reflecting and touching and in contact with lots of other lives. So I have no say or intent in the outcome of these labs, other than that there is a time and a place where people can feel that, experience that, so that that notion of complexity isn't just an intellectual word. It's actually an experience, and that my hope is that just by doing so, whatever it is they do afterwards, or 3 days later, or 2 weeks later, will somehow be informed by that experience. But it's this idea that if there is a way to do a little something there, that's enough, because it will beget. And I don't know what it will beget, and I don't want to. I mean, it's not my prerogative to know. That's not my I how could I know that? So I guess that's really what I've been working on, is this deepening of that experience. And one of the things that comes out of it, to your point, Tyson, is integrity. It's really it's much easier to have to your point, Amanda, hypocrisy if you've compartmentalized your integrity. But when you start to actually perceive the way in which those compartments are all entangled and overlapping and moving, it becomes much more well, it's much more warm, it's much more alive, it's much more viable to be in a kind of integrity, which is not the integrity of following the rules. It's not the integrity of being who you were last week. It's the integrity of being in a situation, whatever it is, in which there is all sorts of change and responsiveness and life happening, and responding to that life with warmth and generosity and those things which will beget more vitality. I found myself the other day in some talk saying something along the lines of, we're actually foreigners in our own future, and that there's so if the changes that we are talking about come to be, we won't recognize our lives, because there's just so much that's changing. So part of it, I think, has to do with readying the body, the mind, the heart, and the relationships you live within to be in that kind of change. And what does that mean? What does, just not to make the change, but just to be ready in it, to be in that kind of flexibility. So I think that's part of it too.
Oh man, there is such a contrast between the pace of what you're talking about and the work you're talking about, and the sense of urgency that Sam's referring to, and they're both right. I guess it comes back to that mass thing that I mentioned with Heisenberg, and that, like, so I guess if you imagine a really big cog, there's like a little cog here spinning fast as hell, like to turn that big one, and it's just turning slow. And I guess you're that big cog, Nora, and the form data work. And it's funny because that's the sense that I'm getting from country is, I keep hearing all these, these movements and you were talking about, the self-actualizing sort of work and people being the change. And so you got all that integral theory stuff, and they're all saying like, clean up, grow up, wake up, show up. It's all these ups, but I'm not hearing that from country. I'm hearing calm down, slow down, settle down, just stop for a minute. think about it. You know, we want to respond to all these problems in the moment, but you know, if we come up with quick, there's too much sickle cell in Africa, you know, let's get this gene editing device here and we'll just get rid of the sickle cell gene. He gone, finished. Look, we've saved Africa. And it's like, well, no, because like that gene's recessive in most people, and that recessive sickle cell gene is the thing that makes people malaria proof. So then all of a sudden everyone's dying of malaria. So then we go, quick, let's kill all the mosquitoes. And then why are those elephants dropping dead? Why are they all dropping dead? Why are the lions crawling? What's going on here? You know, like all these things, they have those big knock-on effects. And the most difficult thing is to feel that sense of urgency, but know that, you know, any of your real-time rapid interventions are probably going to cause more trouble than they solve. You know, so I think like we keep coming back to this theme of diversity of change agents and you know, change making projects and those, you know, 1,000 flowers blooming and all the rest. I think it's I mean, I think that's important, because I think the complex system, you know, that is land, you know, is expressing itself through its agents, its human agents, and it's throwing up everything that's needed. And I guess, you know, but who wants to take that leap of just trusting to that pattern and allowing for emergence? You know, who wants to bank everybody's future on that, rather than just doubling down on what we've been doing already that isn't working? It's a bit of a leap of faith. Be a bit like convincing everybody in Melbourne to shoot their dogs.
This last bit of the conversation is just resonates with a project I'm working on right now. And I sort of thought, why don't we concretize this broad-based conversation about how we might make change in this idea? So 2019, there was a federal election in Australia. For those who worry about climate change, it didn't go so well. We don't need to talk about the lead up to that election and the blame game, but it's certainly one of the diagnoses of that election was, goodness gracious, Australia's going to be in trouble when it comes to thinking about climate change. What do we do? Right? And there are lots of, you know, there are 1,000 flowers in the climate movement in Australia, and some people wanted to rush off and quickly run campaigns about things, as you can imagine, got to stop coal, that sort of stuff. No worries. I mean, they were doing that before the election and wanted to continue doing that after the election. And I was really inspired by the narrative around the Green New Deal that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been talking about in the United States and had spread to other countries. I didn't think that I wanted to like cookie cutter those ideas in Australia, but I definitely thought, feels like that we could talk about, you know, an economic transition that talks about, let's do that, something like that. We'll start a conversation. We did everything incredibly slowly when everyone else was running off doing their random campaigns against a Liberal government that wasn't going to listen to anyone anyway. We slowly built this through a bunch of face-to-face workshops, these relationships, handpicking a bunch of organisations, try to be as diverse as possible. So business, community, climate and union organisations, a few from each area, getting them in the room, being a little agitational. I feel like I've got to understand warm data better, because so much of what you're describing, Nora, I like to think that we do some of that kind of work with people, sort of opening people up to think differently about themselves, giving them an invitation to think differently about who they are in the world and what their organisation is trying to do, partly by being in relationship with people who are different. It was a good process, right? Based on my experience with community organising. And then we get ready to run a big campaign. And then COVID happens, right? And everything, the world changes. And in some ways, we were fortunate because we had all these pre-existing relationships that would be built face-to-face. When it came to the pandemic, actually everyone wanted to get online and talk about things and come up with plans. Anyway, the thing that I wanted to raise is the idea of, you know, Sam, you brought it up, of, you know, the echo chamber of organizations turning into an echo chamber and doing the same thing over and over and over again. Well, I would say that much of the climate movement does that. You know, like I love the climate movement. I think that there are many extraordinary leaders in that space. I love particularly the grassroots of that movement. But I also think that there's that can be a weakness in that space where people just disregard the opinions of those who are different to them. And there's a sort of righteousness that is wrapped in urgency. That's like, well, we don't have time to listen to anyone because the world's burning. So therefore, we're just going to full steam ahead with it, right? Ignoring other voices. And yet, you know, we need to listen to the no, right? There's a big no in Australia that unless you can't go around it, you can't go over it, we have to engage with it, right? We have to have that conversation. And so the thing that's exciting me is that we're doing this, the next stage of this Real Deal project, which is what we're working on, is to go into places, 6 places around the country and build what begins as 3-year projects, but they will last forever, hopefully, in communities where people can start to have these conversations about, well, what does change need to look like for us to feel like we know the world that we want to go to? And that's going to start not with, so tell me all your 6 issues you want to work on. That's not how it's going to start. It's going to start with, so tell us how life is for you. What is your anxiety? Who are you? Where do you place yourself in this place? And it's not a full conversation around land. I don't think some of our communities are there. Some of our communities are not. Some of our communities have big Indigenous populations in them and they're all in the space together. Some of them are less so. Like, I would not pretend to say that we're mastering all these points yet. You know, we're trying. We are trying really hard. But Australia is incredibly diverse. Every place is so different. And, you know, after the last federal election, people were prepared to cut off Queensland. You know, there's horrible, toxic conversations in this country about place. And we don't win by doing any of those things. We win by listening to the no and engaging in those conversations. And until we do, I just don't think we can get to the place we need to be, or it won't emerge until we have those relationships. So I just thought, just, you know, we are not doing it perfectly. There's lots for us to learn, but there is an interesting emergence that we're trying to explore in this climate, how to respond to COVID recovery. What do we do in this time that is trying to take on some of these values and still needs to learn more, but trying to make something work coming out of this that's different to the past.
That's I guess I wanted to roll a little bit onto the last question that Margaret asked, which was something I also wanted to surface in our discussion, which is kind of about the elephant in the room, which is money, and the economic system that obviously most of us are beholden to in some way. Livelihood, you know, to give it a slightly more gentle frame. The kind of work that, you know, I found myself doing at Lifehack, that I see Nora doing with Warm Data Labs, that Amanda was just describing. People don't like funding that work, from my experience. People do not fund you to rewire the relationships in the system. People don't like that language. They like outcomes. They like definites. They like the strategic 5-year plan that's going to go out of, you know, out of use in 3 months, but they want to see that you've got a 5-year plan so that they'll give you the money to do whatever you want to do. So I'm wondering a little bit more about that. So Margaret sort of framed it a little bit in terms of the biggest constraints to action, but I think it's also the biggest constraints to doing the work that we need to get done, and what the other avenues might be for financing that kind of work.
I think Amanda, in a sense, already answered that question when she talked about Elsie, the Women's Refuge, where they couldn't get funding, and they just went ahead and did it. And yes, you can say, oh well, that's very naive. The forces that we're against are very wealthy and they have lots of resources and whatever. But in some ways, a subtext of our discussion is that we're imprisoned by our own preconceptions about the nature of change and how it can happen. And a lot of our preconceptions are historically bound. They come out of a different period. They don't work in this period, or they're very unlikely to work. And it seems to me that there's two big preconceptions that a lot of people engaged in change have that we've got to start letting go on. One is the grand narrative, that we have this vision of where we're going and the society we want, and we're going to, push forward with that narrative and roll over anyone who doesn't agree with us. And part of that is what historically you could think of as vanguard politics, that here you have an elite group of political activists who know what needs to be done, they know what's right, and they're going to do it, and they're going to lead us towards that. And I must say, when Nora said earlier on, perhaps this is not the time for leadership in that sense, it's the time for response, of preparing ourselves to respond. And it made me think of, there's a principle from cybernetics, which is sometimes called the law of requisite variety. And basically it says the capacity of any system to understand and learn is a function of the degree to which its internal complexity matches the complexity of the external environment, or at least approaches the extent. And so many of our campaigns don't do that. They're very homogenous. They're very, single track thinking in many ways, 19th century change thinking. And it seems to me that if we're really learning about how to respond, we've got to be taking up some of the points that Sam was making about how do we foster diversity within our own communities and networks in a way that avoids them becoming just talking shops where nobody can agree on anything, but allows, in a sense, your discussions, Amanda, with people that led to, in the context of setting up the Sydney Alliance, was about creating that kind of diversity within the change movement that reflected the diversity of the wider community. And it seems to me that's the challenge we face, how to do that and how to get off those old tracks.
I'm looking at all those questions and I'm seeing ideas like, Malthusian checks and phase changes and, the energy transfers that happen in phase changes and all these kinds of things. And, a lot of different ideas coming through there. And I guess I wouldn't mind just springboarding off those questions into just foregrounding our next session, because I'm kicking off our next roundtable. And I think the answer is that the direction you need to go in is to go where the energy is shifting to. And you have to go towards the basins of attraction and gather around that waterhole. That kind of needs to happen. You might have a great idea over here and then bust your hump trying to get all the energy together to shift over your way and all the attention and focus and resources. But you're better to just go to where that's happening. And where that's all shifting now, and will be increasingly over the next decade and even just the next couple of years, is towards a kind of a knowledge economy. Like I think the idea of knowledge economy has been around for a long time, but I think it's becoming increasingly, it's going to be really the only option for most people. There might be still some service stuff around for a while, but I think the knowledge economy is going to be where it's at. So I believe we need to start throwing around some ideas of an Anthropocene transition, like what a transitional knowledge economy will look like. What are the flows and the ways of tracking those flows and signaling through those flows? What forms will knowledge transmission need to take, and what kinds of knowledge, what kind of vetting do we need to be able to have a standard of quality knowledge? And et cetera, all of those things. So I think next time I'm going to come into that idea of knowledge production, knowledge transmission, what that looks like in a transitional time in the Anthropocene, and I think we'll get into those questions a lot more deeply.
Oh, so Peter wrote this sort of statement / questions. We are animals, obviously, but have we lost touch with that? And even though I think it was just possibly a reaction to just an interesting conversation we're having, I actually think it's an incredibly profound point that sort of gets to the heart of how we are breaking our ability to work with others. You know, think of how someone goes, "Oh, you're an animal," as a way to sort of demonize another person, right? That's, you know, we distinguish ourselves from animals. Animals are stupid and dumb and dirty and violent or whatever they are, not like me. It reminds me of how people talk about people as terrorists or people as crazy and insane. You know, it's using these labels, whether the label be animal or whether the label be some other one of those words, to sort of create these cleavages of division between people as though I'm superior to everyone else. And I think that same idea of superiority is killing us, right? Literally, like no exaggeration, is killing us as a human species. But it's also what's killing the planet too. Like our ability to just cleavage these spaces. So actually, I think, yes, Peter, you're completely right. Many of us have lost touch with that, and reconnecting that space is precisely what we need to do to be able to sort of get to the how. It was one of the elements of how we move from here to a better place.
Chris Duffield has got a question that says, when creating new modes of change, we need to move slow. When we're seeking to disrupt existing power structures, is it then okay to move fast?
I'd like to enter in on this time question a little bit, because the relationship to time is something that touches every part of our lives, from, you know, the way when we eat, how we grow, how we are with each other, how we are in the land, and so much more as well. It's been really interesting to see over the last 8 months the way in which relationship to time has been affected by this pandemic and lockdown and separation from each other, and the ability to perceive, was that yesterday or was it 2 weeks ago? And sort of like where the structures are around which time is being perceived. And without those structures, there's I know that I am definitely experiencing a blurriness that I've never really had before, except for when I was out in nature for long periods of time and couldn't really remember, is it Wednesday? Who cares? What's Wednesday mean, right? What is Wednesday? I don't know. What is this time thing? And what do we mean when we say we don't have time? And I'm remembering this fantastic thing that happened once with my daughter when she was, I don't know, she couldn't have been more than 11. Maybe she was 12. And we were in the car and she was, I guess YouTube had already had happened. And she made this comment that the new Rihanna video had, I don't know, 2 million likes, and it had only been up for 30 minutes. And she was trying to think about how that worked. And I was like, I was unimpressed, thinking Rihanna, you know, whatever. So thinking she was trying to say that Rihanna was popular or rich or, you know, something, but that wasn't what she was interested in at all. She was trying to figure out how 2 million people had a 3-minute experience in a half an hour. And that the thinking that came out of that was I think very profound. And she said, you know, Mom, if there's 8 billion people in the world, then really 8 every minute is 8 billion minutes. Every year is 8 billion years. And so she kind of took this notion of time and went that way with it, and made it into something that was distributed in a very different way. And I think that's what I would like to bring in, is that time is complex, and our relationship to it is also filled with complexity in the spirit of requisite variety. So we don't have time, but what we have is time. And so I think I'll leave it at that, because I think when we, get in a rush, we come up with solutions. It's easy to come up with solutions like the ones Tyson was referring to, that are in the spirit of efficiency. And that efficiency becomes reductionist. It's an efficiency to the betterment of one part of a complex whole, one part of a thing. And that, of course, spins out into all manner of consequences of consequences of consequences. So does it really take more time to tend in another way? And in that case, really, what is time? So I'll leave it at that.
So really quickly, time does run differently on social media platforms. Like, I know the guy who did the algorithms, he made clocks so that the platform owners could try and track the time of things like that, especially with viral stuff. Because if you think about all that sharing with those millions of people, one person sharing it, depending on how many followers they have on the reshare, you know what I mean? It actually ends up being a completely different model of time, which is very, very, very interesting, because there are a lot of dimensions to it, and it's very complex, but a hell of a lot can happen in a short time on there, which means things can get broken faster than they could get fixed. But it also means that, it could go the other way as well.
So thank you very much to our roundtable guests and all our participants. So thank you and good night.